In this unit, we're going to take a look at American foreign policy through the second half of the 1800s through past the end of World War I. In this particular lesson, we're going to look at the start of that policy. This picture shows that Commodore Matthew Perry, back in 1853, Commodore Perry had sailed a fleet of warships into Tokyo Bay, Japan, and negotiated a treaty with the Japanese, opening 2 Japanese ports to American trade. Japan had been a very isolated nation prior to this. The treaty you can see here that was negotiated was called the Treaty of Kanagawa, and Commodore Perry secures the 2 Japanese ports open to U.S. trade. The Industrial Revolution left the United States with a problem for which Captain Alfred Mahan here had a solution. The United States was producing more goods than people in the United States could purchase. That left factories with a surplus of goods. The European nations and Japan had already begun a policy known as imperialism, a policy by which strong nations extend their political, military, and economic control over weaker territories. The European nations and Japan had already carved up Africa and most of Asia for the raw materials and the natural resources in those areas. Mahan was arguing essentially in this quote here that it was time for America basically to do the same. We needed to look outside the United States for markets to sell to for our surplus goods. Mahan was a widely respected captain in the Navy. If you take a moment to read this quote here, he makes the argument that we will end up, if we go outward overseas to expand our markets, we will end up in conflict with European nations or whomever, such as pirates on the open seas. As a result, our merchant fleet is going to need to be protected by a large navy. So Mahan was advocating that we build up a large modern navy, something we did not have at the time, and something that the government is going to listen to and, in fact, go ahead and do. This is a photo of the USS Iowa in the late 1800s, late 1890s as a matter of fact, meant to indicate that by the late 1800s, the United States did become a very powerful military nation because of taking Mahan's advice and building up a large navy to protect its merchant ships crossing the oceans. It made no sense to go out into the Atlantic Ocean looking for areas to colonize or markets to take, because the Europeans had already carved up Africa, as I said. So we're going out into the Pacific Ocean. You can see here that we're going to ultimately overthrow the Queen of Hawaii, and we will later annex the Hawaiian Islands. I should point out the U.S. doesn't actually overthrow the Hawaiian Queen, but the planters, the American planters that had been on the Hawaiian Islands for some time, actively organize the overthrow of the Queen and look for the United States to annex Hawaii. The map here shows islands in the Pacific Ocean that the U.S. did annex, and there's a reason for this. The merchant ships as well as the naval ships are going to need refueling stations. These were coal-powered steamships, so a number of these islands are going to serve as naval bases and as refueling stations, or coaling stations, if you will, for passage back and forth across the Pacific Ocean. The goal of our forays across the Pacific Ocean ultimately would be China, but as this map indicates here, China was already largely occupied by the countries of France, outlined in yellow, Britain, Germany, Japan, and Russia. So you can see the areas of China under foreign control were the major areas of interest to any country looking to do business in China. I need to point out that the areas controlled by the various foreign nations were under their complete control. The Chinese government itself was extremely weak and unable to hold the areas under foreign control, basically meaning that the foreigners essentially owned those pieces of China under their control. These areas were known as spheres of influence, and ultimately the U.S. is going to want to come into China. The U.S. comes up with a policy known as the open door policy. Since there was no area in China worth taking over direct control, the U.S. decides it wants to trade in the areas under foreign control, and China was going to need to talk to those countries about doing just that. Of course, those countries were not going to be that excited about allowing United States merchants to trade in the areas under their control. Hence the open door policy. What the open door policy was essentially a letter that Secretary of State John Hay sent to each nation that controlled a piece of China, stating that the United States expected full access to that nation's portion of China under its control. The foreign governments agreed, as these political cartoons indicate. The major reason that these foreign governments agreed to allow the United States to come into their spheres of influence in China was simply that at this point in time they respected the size of America's Navy and were not interested in doing battle with the United States over this issue. This cartoon in front of you, you see the United States having the keys to China, if you will. The key representing America's open door policy. The smaller gentlemen surrounding Uncle Sam are representative of the foreign countries that had spheres of influence in China. So the U.S. was able to get its way and sell surplus goods in China without having to fire a shot. The Chinese people themselves were less than thrilled to be controlled by foreign nations, and they are going to rise up in a rebellion known as the Boxer Rebellion. This took place in 1900, and the Chinese are going to rebel against foreigners and foreign influence in China. It's not going to amount to much. It's going to be crushed by a multinational force, but Chinese anger towards foreigners will remain. This quote from Albert Beveridge in 1898 suggests that everybody at this point, or most everybody in Congress, agreed with Mahan and the course of action that the United States had taken, where it says most future wars will be conflicts for commerce. The power that rules the Pacific, therefore, is the power that rules the world. There was an understanding at this point. The U.S. was that power. We had built a modern military, a navy in particular, that was capable of taking on the other major powers of the world. To sum up, then, we needed to find markets for our surplus goods, and we are going to go out into the Pacific to find them, which is going to have the United States essentially become an imperialistic nation, following the path of the European nations and Japan. To do this, we're going to follow Captain Alfred Mahan's advice, build a large and modern navy to protect our merchant ships crossing the Pacific. We are going to annex Hawaii. Formally, we do so in 1898, ultimately. And we're going to take control of a number of islands in the Pacific to use both as naval bases to protect those merchant ships and as coaling or refueling stations in the Pacific. The ultimate prize that we want is China. We are going to create the open door policy, which, as I said in the lesson, was a letter sent to the nations that controlled spheres of influence in China. And we're going to assert our right to trade in the areas under foreign control in China, and those countries are going to allow us to do it. So the question remains then for future lessons. We've got this large military, large navy, and future presidents are going to make decisions in terms of what we're going to do with it.